and welcome to today's lecture on Chapter 6, Nonverbal Communication. Now, our book describes nonverbal communication as messages that are expressed without using words. This is only partially true. Nonverbal does encompass words, but in how they're said and the way they're pronounced. More on that later. Did you know that nonverbal communication is everything? If I were to tell you that that is the secret to understanding communication, would you believe me? Well, there was a professor at UCLA named Dr. Albert Mehrabian, and he extensively studied nonverbal communication, and he found that 93% of a message is derived from the nonverbal aspect of the communication. 93%. That includes gestures, sounds, facial expressions, touch, what the speaker is wearing, their posture, all of it. 93%. And the 7% remaining are the words that the speaker says. So let that sink in for a little bit. And if you want to know where to find the true meaning of the message, the answer lies in nonverbal. So let's talk about the nature of nonverbal communication, where you truly find the meaning of a person's message. Nonverbal communication is literally impossible to avoid. We're doing it all the time. In fact, if you're sitting there watching this lecture now with your arms crossed, you're not saying a word, but your body language is. So no matter what, it's something that consciously or unconsciously we are doing. We are putting off a message that has value, and we're not even opening our mouths. Now, nonverbal behavior is part of our identity management. Remember, we talked about that in chapter 2. We talked about identity management are the strategies that we use to influence how other people view us. So nonverbal, very important with that. This is displayed by how people dress, how people wear their hair, their personal style, their behavior, their posture, their gestures, their proximity to other people, all of it. And it's all going to make sense after this lecture is over. Nonverbal cues also help define relationships between people. If people are holding hands, that's a pretty good sign that they're a couple. So when we watch people, when we observe people, we highly lean on the nonverbal communication and behavior to establish relationships and understand the dynamics between those two people. Nonverbal behavior can also be ambiguous and confusing, but understanding it is essential to your success as a competent communicator. So let's talk about the functions of nonverbal communication, because nonverbal has a lot of different functions. The first is to repeat a verbal message. So if you ask me directions to the nearest coffee shop and I say it's north of here about 2 blocks, and then I point, the act of pointing repeats the verbal message that I say north of here about 2 blocks. Now, substituting is, instead of saying the word, you do a behavior. So if you ask me a question, instead of me saying, I don't know, I do this. That would establish the fact that I don't know the answer to your question. So nonverbal can also function as a substitution for a verbal word. The third thing that nonverbal does is complements a behavior. So it reinforces the content of a verbal message. So if I say, guys, you better have that assignment in on time, the act of me pounding my fist down or slapping my hand down on the table emphasizes the word, the verbal message that I mean business, and you better not be late with your assignment. Nonverbal behavior or nonverbal communication also functions to regulate conversation. So what does that mean? It's the flow of conversation. And as adults, you know when it's appropriate to enter into a conversation. But if you've ever had a conversation with little people, aka children, you know that they interrupt a lot. They're not quite sure when they can enter the conversation, so they just barge right in. But nonverbal cues help us understand when it's our turn to talk. And then finally, contradiction. This is a huge part of nonverbal communication. If someone says to you something, but their body language says something else, look at their body language. So for example, if you ask me if anything's wrong and I do this, no, really, everything's fine. Really, it's fine. First of all, if a woman says it's fine, you know it's not fine. And with my arms crossed, that closed off behavior definitely indicates that everything is terrible. Okay? So if there's a contradiction between the verbal words being spoken and the nonverbal body language, look to the nonverbal for the key, the answer that really lies beneath. So let's talk about deception and nonverbal cues. A lot of people think that they can spot a liar, and some people are really good liars. I mean, they could sell ice to an Eskimo, right? Like they can really work you over. And I want you to think right now about people you know that are really good liars. What makes them a good liar? How do they do it? And how can you spot a liar? Well, do you know that people only have a 50-50 chance of really detecting a lie, even when the deceiver is a child? And children can be pretty deceptive, right? Pretty good liars. But how can you really tell? Knowing someone really well doesn't usually make it easier to detect deception with people. Some people are just really good at it. I personally am amazed how people can hook themselves up to a lie detector test and remain calm as a cucumber when they're truly guilty. Now, we have a preconceived bias to think people are either truthful or not, and it interferes with our judgment. This is called truth bias or deception bias. Think about it. You feel either one of these things with people. You usually are trustful or trustworthy of people and feel that people are honest and good and telling the truth, or you have the opposite view. People are always lying. There's no way that they're telling the truth, so I'm just going to think that everyone's lying. Think about it. You fall usually on one of these two continuums. The lies are easily caught when deception is spontaneous and emotional and the deceiver feels bad about lying. So sometimes they're true giveaways. You can stammer, you stutter, you're avoiding eye contact with the person, you're fidgeting, you're playing with your hair, you're putting your hands in your pocket, you're tapping your foot. You can't control your nonverbal. And that was one thing I wanted to say, is that nonverbal is oftentimes uncontrollable and it's below the surface. So you're not even aware that you're acting in a certain way non-verbally. Like, for example, if you've ever been upset about something, angry about something, you wanted to punch a hole through a wall, but you had to go throughout your day and be an adult, right? And you figure, well, I'm just going to hide it. And people ask you, hey, Joe, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, but it's all over your face. So sometimes the nonverbal cues just give you away. It's easier said than done to suppress and manage those feelings. So let's talk about kinesic nonverbal communication. So kinesics are nonverbal cues on how people use their faces and their bodies nonverbally. So one important thing about aspect of nonverbal is posture. And I know your moms always told you to sit up straight and pull your shoulders back, right? But posture is extremely important and it sends a message to others and even to yourself. So stand up tall and straight, pull your shoulders back, and exude that confidence, because that's going to be important, especially on speech day. Now, manipulators are fidgety behaviors, not manipulative people, manipulators. Okay, so manipulators are when you're standing up in front of class and you're giving a speech and your hand's in your pocket, or you're touching your hair, or you're touching your glasses, or you're touching your clothing. And these are all things that students do, by the way. So this is why it's important that you videotape yourself and practice in front of a camera so you can actually see what you look like. You'd be amazed. So be careful with the manipulators. Also, smiling. It's good for you. Do you know how contagious smiling is? You should try it sometime. It actually takes more muscles to frown than it does to smile. Fun fact. All right, eye contact is a very important thing, and you know it is in my class, especially on speech day. It's important to look at the audience and make that connection with them. But culturally, in some cultures, eye contact is actually disrespectful. This is true in many Asian cultures. So it's really important that you understand your audience, because as Americans and as Westerners, we place a high priority on eye contact. And we tend to think that if people are not looking us in the eye when they're speaking, that they're being deceitful or untruthful. So they're being deceptive. So be careful with your eye contact. An affect blend is when you have multiple emotions showing in your face at the same time. So for example, if someone says to you, "We're going to Disney World," right? So you're excited and you're surprised, which is the two most awesome emotions to have at the same time, right? So that would be a good example of an affect blend. A bad example of an affect blend would be, "You're fired," right? In which case you're scared and sad, or scared and afraid, right? No one wants to hear that news. So think about how your face is a very complicated channel of expression, and how you can show different emotions in different parts of your face at the same time. That's called an affect blend. Now, haptics is the study of touch. And touch is an important part of nonverbal communication, but you've got to be careful with touch, because some people are huggers and some people are not. So think to yourself, are you a hugger? You know if you are, right? So huggers hug. They hug with their whole body, right? And non-huggers don't. They don't like to be touched. But you have to be careful in this day and age, because touch could be inappropriately taken by the receiver, and that could be a bad thing. So again, you're in your mind, your meaningless hug could be construed as something else, which could get you into a lot of trouble, especially if it's at work. All right, voice. We talked about how nonverbal communication is communication without words. And I told you that's not necessarily true, because there are certain aspects of the spoken words that are an element of nonverbal. So let me explain what that means. Paralanguage. Paralanguage is nonverbal cues that are vocal. And this includes your tone of voice, your speed, how quickly you speak, your pitch, how high or how low your voice is, the number and length of pauses, and if you stammer or stutter, or if you say those evil sounds that I don't want you to say during your speeches, the uhs, the ums, the the like, all right? Those things are an aspect of nonverbal communication, and they're called paralanguage. So it's important that you understand that nonverbal is extremely complex, because it encompasses both vocal and non-vocal aspects. Now, nonverbal cues and attractiveness. Would you not agree with me that good-looking people in our society receive perks over people that are not so attractive? Facts. The good-looking people will get the job, they'll get the raise, they'll get the promotion, they'll get the girl, they'll get the guy, they'll get the break. Think about how many times your good looks have helped you out of a bad situation, or have parlayed you into a good situation. That is how our world works, unfortunately. People use their attractiveness to their advantage. Unfortunately, Sometimes the attractive person will be hired for the job, even though they're not the most qualified person for the job, or they're not the most intelligent person. It's a sad but true reality in this world. So let's talk about some of these nonverbal cues as far as attractiveness goes. So good looks are definitely an advantage, but sometimes extreme attractiveness can be intimidating to others. So watch out for that. Also, clothing, colors, and style influence perceived attractiveness. Part of nonverbal is your clothing style, your hair color, your hairstyle, your eye color, your makeup, your accessories, what kind of purse you carry, your backpack, what kind of car you drive, all of that, your jewelry, your artifacts. These are items in your wardrobe that define your self-identity and how you express yourself. Tattoos, piercings, that's a part of your nonverbal communication because that's a way that people express themselves. So again, it's all encompassing. It's actually quite overwhelming when you think about the power of nonverbal and how much weight is placed on how someone looks and sounds and carries themselves. So, moving on, let's talk about how people can interpret nonverbal cues. So, one way that they can interpret is to be very observant. Watch, look, be silent, observe things, take notes of what people are wearing and how they're standing and all of it. Because again, these are the cues and the clues that help you interpret the message. Also, you want to consider the context. The context is the setting in which the communication is taking place. That is highly important as well. Whether it's a formal presentation in a boardroom or a casual conversation amongst two people, that has an effect on the nonverbal communication. Also, you want to use perception checking. We talked about how important that is on lessening misunderstanding and miscommunication. And perception checking is a 3-step process in which you state what someone's behavior is, number 1. Number 2, give at least 2 possible explanations for that person's behavior. And then number 3, to ask the person to clarify the behavior and how you should interpret it. So use the perception checking because that will help get you out of a lot of trouble by not assuming. And then finally, I want to end today's lecture on gender and nonverbal communication. Men and women speak differently, they act differently, and they use communication differently. But there's not too big of a difference in gender and nonverbal as many people think. Women tend to be more expressive in their communication, and the media portrays the media portrayals emphasize women's looks and men's ruggedness. Of course, remember how the media influences our perception of a lot of things. And generally, it underrepresents gender diversity. So think about that because not all men act one way and not all women act another way. And so it's important that you are sensitive and aware of that. And women tend to be more sensitive to nonverbal cues just because traditionally we have been more responsible for attending to children and help raise them and help care for them. So that's always been a reason why women tend to be more in tune with the nonverbal cues. So what I want you to take away from today's lecture is that the true meaning of the message lies in the nonverbal. The next time you're not quite sure what someone meant, try and put less emphasis on the words they say and pay attention more to that 93% that is so vital and so important to really understanding the true meaning behind the message. Thanks for listening.